Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. My guest today is Gede Parma. Gede, who also goes by the name Fio Aengus, is a Balinese-Australian witch, international teacher, magical mentor, author, and initiate. Gede cherishes the initiatory mysteries of 4 powerful witchcraft traditions. Gede's work links animism to heresy, sorcery, poetry, spirit work, sex, fairy faith, and folklore. They currently reside in the lands of the Jagera and Turrbal Peoples in so-called Brisbane, Australia. Today we discuss what it's like to be at the crossroads of culture and spiritual traditions. As a multi-intersectional person, Gede shares his experiences of racism in pagan community. We also dive into the topic of cultural appropriation in a spiritual context and the power of magical initiation. To learn more, visit gedeparma.com. That's GEDEPARMA.com. Hi, Fio. Welcome to the show.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for waking up early. I know it's early there in Australia where you are.
Yes.
And you're in the future.
I am in the future.
Yeah.
It is true.
So I have a lot of juicy questions to talk to you about today, but I thought that we would start out by just having you share with us what your first spiritual tradition was that you were first introduced to or taught.
Yeah, okay. So I was born into one, and it is most often just referred to as Balinese Hinduism. So, which I guess could be considered to be a religious, philosophical, magical, spiritual tradition. And it is a tradition that obviously arises out of Bali, and it is a specific kind of strand of Hinduism that may look and feel different, not divergent, but distinct unto itself from the kind of Hinduisms that exist in the Indian subcontinent and Nepal. Yeah, so I was born in Bali, which is an island in the Indonesian archipelago. And my father is Balinese, and my mother is a white Australian, Irish, and British descent. And Balinese Hinduism and the brand of that spirituality that comes through my particular family is very disciplined. And there are several mystical and sorcerous practices and tantric practices within it. So I was familiar at a young age with different breath work and the chakra systems, of which there are many. And I was familiar with certain divinities that I later discovered were also, I guess, proliferating in the West, like Shiva and Ganesha, and Saraswati and Durga, and Hanuman. And the idea of magic as well, because not every family in Bali practices magic, but certainly my father's family is very involved in spirit work and magic. And when I was 11, I realized I was a witch, and it kind of was easy for me in that regard.
And do they use that term witch in that context?
No, of course not. So I don't use the term witchcraft for what they do, even when it's so obviously parallel. I just don't do it out of cultural respect. I have an auntie who is married to a British-Australian man, and they own quite a big hotel together in the north of Bali. And she's culturally Balinese. She's never lived anywhere else. But I remember her once referring to my grandmother, my father's mother, as a witch. It kind of just rolled off her tongue. And I think that's because she is quite like she's married to a Westerner, and certain concepts, I guess, syncretized inside of her in a particular way. But certainly the way the word witch the English word witch was introduced to the Balinese was, as an evil doer, as someone who uses magic malevolently.
Probably similar to the way a lot of Western people who are not witches think a witch is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Through fairy tales and movies and that kind of thing. And so when did you first discover what you now identify as witchcraft and start practicing or studying that?
When I was really young. So it happened when I was 11, and it kind of just started happening very organically. Like I just kind of realized I was one, and that was before I found anything like book-wise about that. I just kind of it didn't necessarily wake up and realize, oh, I'm a witch. It just kind of unfolded. It was that word. I would see things in the media, or I would hear what people were saying, or I would feel the idea of it. And it just felt like as naff as this sounds, it just felt like my destiny in a really intense way. And anything that, as an 11 and a 12-year-old, anything that had the word witch on it, I would take in. I would be like, okay, I'm going to read that strange book and I'm going to watch this strange film. And I was sorting my way through all of it. But at the same time, coming back to myself, like discovering practices or adapting or adopting practices from books I would find at the library or at the secondhand store. I grew up in a very Christian town in Queensland in Australia. I was raised in Australia. So I had to kind of be quite discreet. My mother urged me to be quite discreet about my practice of witchcraft in this very Christian town. But then in high school, I was a little bit more brazen, and so I would tell my friends. And in high school, when you tell your friends, they tell everyone else. So I remember that, and then suddenly in grade 8 and 9, I became known as a witch, and that was actually kind of complex. It began a lot of bullying, and, it was complicated. But certainly I discovered, back when I first came to witchcraft, I read books that told me that witchcraft was an ancient tradition that went back to the Celtic, British, and Irish. And some of that kind of I knew was a little bullshitty, but I could feel the ineffable, mysterious spirit of the witch. And to this day, that is how I talk about it, that the witch is a spirit of humanity wedded to the wild. And that being a witch is like being an activated immune cell within the Earth's own consciousness. And that I actually experienced that witches are born and that witches discover their witches at some point. I don't really think, and this is controversial, I don't think that you can just become one. I do think that every human definitely can practice magic, however, but I think that witchcraft is a very particular kind of phenomenon that happens in human history. And I think that it's an ecstatic and oracular and shamanistic and sorceress phenomenon. And I don't think it needs to be religious, like a lot of modern witchcraft makes it out to be. I think it's a cosmological, internal phenomenon. And I think that it's actually really important in humans' relationship with the rest of nature. And I think that's why for so long, the witch in popular culture and in fairy tales has worn what is considered an ugly, haggard face. And that is because we have broken our covenants with nature. So of course, the way wild nature will turn to the rest of humanity will be in this ugly, furious manner, because I believe that I experience that witches are holding that spirit.
So I always like to ask people on the show who identify as a witch, what does that mean to you? And I know it's probably, you've already started to give your definition of it, but what does it mean for the people who are listening who are like, I don't know exactly what he's talking about here?
Yeah, so I guess I'm a bit more specific than some about what it means. So for me, it means that I am a spirit worker. It means that I perceive spirits and mysterious ones. It means that I have intimate and sometimes erotic relationships with them. And it translates as I am able to twist and bend fate, which to me isn't something set in stone, but is like an organic unfolding, as like the Nordic or Scandinavian concept of weird, where we get our modern day English word weird from. It's something that unfolds. And I, as a witch, have and continue to learn to refine the arts of twisting and bending and co-weaving with what I would call grandmother weaver. And that is all ecstatic to me. When I talk about witchcraft to people or what it means to be a witch, I often talk about ecstasy or ecstatic practice. And I think a lot of people do. And for me, that translates not as, like some people I think see drumming circles instantly and naked shimmering bodies around fire. Like it could look like that, but I'm not talking about outer forms. I'm talking about an inner discipline. Like when I say ecstatic, I actually kind of mean something that's really engaged and really disciplined and is consciously connecting to the intimacy of the breath, to the darkness between the stars, and erotically, sensuously engaging with the life force in order to understand more about myself and all my parts, in order to understand my relationship with the different spirits. And in order I do have an aspiration in my witchcraft. It's not just something I do or something I am. I'm also working towards mastery. And for me, that means that I seek to master the art of magic, which to me is based on self-knowledge. and that when I die, whatever the mystery is after death, I wish to become one of the mighty ones. Like, I don't know how many lives that will take me, but I wish to become one of the mighty ones. I actually have that aspiration, and a lot of witches I work with have that aspiration. It's not some vague notion. I wish to become, and it's kind of like if people are familiar with the Buddhist concept of bodhisattva. It's a very similar concept, and I wish to aid and defend and uphold my kin from the other world when I am able to, and to become a being who is godlike and can go into the cauldron and out again at will. So I have a very clear aspiration, and that's why I am a witch, but that's also why I practice witchcraft.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I love that. I'm also curious to know, as a queer person, I've noticed that other queer witches, there can be a little bit of an overlap or a sort of one influencing the other in terms of discovering your witchness and discovering your queerness. And I was wondering what that was like for you.
Oh my God, so intimately linked. Like at the same time, I think I knew I was queer at the same time as I knew I was a witch. And I think it is the same to me. Like, witch could also be a way of talking about my sexuality, really. And the way in which I move through the world is not necessarily the same as some other queer people, even though we're completely diverse and, heretical, all of us, within the overculture. I feel that because I experience sex as a possible way to engage the infinite, like, I love pleasure, I love getting down, and when I'm actually engaging in sex with other consenting adults, like, sometimes it's far and few between, sometimes it's very constant in my life in that way. But in terms of my own self-possessed sexuality and how that kind of engages politics or engages social justice or engages emotionality, I feel like it's the same as being a witch for me. Like, I can't even separate them out. Certainly when I first started studying Western forms of witchcraft, I was a very precocious child. I used to sit and read the dictionary, because whenever I was asking my mother what a word meant, she just said, read the dictionary. So I did. And I read the entire dictionary, and I think that aided me to have a really kind of vast lexicon. But it also aided me to start to really wonder about words and what they mean. And I kind of came into witchcraft, and I started reading variants of, like, Wicca, right? And as you know, that is really polarity based. And a lot of modern Wicca and Gardnerian witchcraft is very connected to gender essentialist models and binary models. And I was so confused. I knew in my heart that witchcraft was actually more queer than I was defining. I was like, this isn't witchcraft. As a 12 and 13-year-old, I was like, this isn't witchcraft. I know it to be a form of witchcraft now, but at the time I was so confused. And so I would just feel like trying to find something that sang to me as a queer person, because so often a lot of the books I was reading were actually cancelling out queerness and homosexuality. Of course, later I discovered traditions that completely embraced and centered those things.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, I do think it's really interesting how queer people who have a more deeper spiritual expression, whether it's a witch or some other identity, how the emerging of those things come at the same time. And I would be curious to know, since I study psychology, like, what, from a neurobiological perspective, is there some part of the brain that is waking up around spiritual identity along with sexual identity at the same time? People have seen those connections. Well, I wanted to switch gears a little bit, and we'll probably switch back and forth as we move forward, and talk a little bit more about why I really wanted to have you on the show, which is stuff that I saw you posting about on Facebook around cultural appropriation and racism, particularly within the realms of spirituality. And I think that particularly you, as someone with multiple intersectionalities and being multicultural and biracial and having one parent who is a white person from Australia, that I was really curious to hear more about what you had to say about that. So I don't know where to begin, but I guess I'm just curious, maybe starting out with when you first started to experience either racism or cultural appropriation within your own spiritual path?
There are definitely things I can pinpoint, say. There are so many stories. And I think also it should be said that this is the soup in which we swim. All of us, we all are swimming in misogyny and queerphobia, anthropocentrism, perhaps worst of all, and white supremacy and colonialism. This is what we're swimming in. And so that, of course, affects what we're drawing a circle around and naming spirituality, right? For me, I even sometimes back away from that word. I've used the word spirituality a lot in my life, but in the past few years, I find it to kind of be like, why am I even saying that? Like that word, because to me, it is completely everything. And it's easy for me because my full-time job is as a witch, like for everything I do for the past 10 years. But so I can easily just say that. I get that. Also, I guess growing up and being like, my parents are still married. And when I was 2, my mother and my father and I moved to Australia, and my sister was born. And at some point, my father moved back to Bali because my mother suggested he did, because she could tell that that his soul was dying, because the Balinese people are completely embedded within the land. They are indigenous to the land, and their culture is deeply intricate and totally place-based and very animistic. And like, she could just see that he was dying inside, so she said, go back. So I was raised in a place away from my father and away from, I guess, that lived connection. And my mother definitely did her best to always, she encouraged us to continue to do Balinese dance. And there was a gamelan in Toowoomba, which is really strange. A gamelan is a Balinese orchestra. And so she would take us there and we would play Balinese music with mostly white people. And Balinese people would come over and instruct these mostly white people. I think I was raised to be very proud of my Balinese heritage. And I would ask questions of my mother's heritage too. And she always told me, as far as she knew, that, she said, my people are farmers and they come from, Ireland and Scotland and England. I've discovered a lot since through all kinds of things. But I was just very proud of those things as a kid. Like, I'm proud to be descended from Balinese people and these Celtic people. Like, nothing struck me as odd. And then I guess as I started to age and go to high school, I encountered all kinds of strange rhetoric and bullshit. I encountered people who were anti-Aboriginal, which is a very big problem in Australia. Obviously, we are in occupied land at all times, and sovereignty was never ceded. There are no treaties. And of course, any treaty that existed on a pseudo level, there are a few, is bullshit and just not real, and probably happened at the threat of military death. So I grew up with that. Now I know more historically, but I could sense the periphery of it as a child. And I started to see anti-Aboriginality, which is a big, big core problem in the country that I live in. I think people didn't know what to do with me because often there's an experience with mixed race young people where we definitely don't look white, but they don't know what to do with us. They're like, oh, you're racially ambiguous. So I get questions all the time, continuing to this day. Where are you from? Where are your parents from? And then I just ask, what do you mean by that? Because I know, I just counter it immediately in a very neutral, usually, voice, because I know they're asking me about my ethnicity, which of course white Australians don't get asked. I was sitting recently with a friend a few months ago at a cafe, and a woman came up and he is pale-skinned of European descent, what we would call a white Australian. And she was a white Australian, and she came up to us and she asked me, she said, oh, where are you from? And my friend is sitting right in front of me. And he's just like, what is going on? Because obviously it doesn't happen to him. And I said, oh, do you mean my ethnicity? And she said, yes. And I said, oh, well, my mother is a white Australian of Irish and British descent, and my father is Balinese. She's like, oh, Bali. And then she went on, because people in Australia think they know about Bali because it's so close and a lot of Australians go on holiday there. Anyway, so that's more recent. But as a kid, I definitely saw racism all around me, not necessarily directed towards me. I think it was directed towards my sister a lot. But here's the thing, I don't know, because certainly it may have been directed at me or my family, but maybe I didn't notice. And certainly sometimes there were negative attitudes towards me during primary school, but I never know. Was it because I was being naughty that day? Was it because of uncritiqued internal bias? And probably all of the above. And certainly there were times that I felt particularly singled out, but I couldn't explain it. And then in high school, were they singling me out because I was out and queer? Because I came out in year 9 when I was 14 years old. Were they singling me out because I was mixed race? Were they singling me out because everyone knew I was a witch? There was a lot going on when I was in high school and I was a very kind of brazen, outspoken teenager. And people, I think a lot of the teachers got really fed up with me because I would constantly provoke them and bring things up. So I guess it's hard to pick apart because it's just, I definitely don't have the experience of an Aboriginal person in Australia. I definitely don't have the experience of a Black person in the United States. Those are very specific experiences. And I think it's, sometimes when I hear people say person of color, I'm like, when I hear white people say that, sometimes what I'm hearing is this kind of, again, whitewashing of this entire grouping of people. But for those of us who, I remember when I chose to identify as a person of color, it was to emancipate myself from white supremacist ideology. To say I am a person of color was to politically and socially say I am not going to be subsumed by white supremacy. Because some of my friends, well-meaning friends, would even kind of negate or ignore, 50% of me. And not even 50% of me, because it's not like it is just all of me. The entire experience of being mixed race is all of me. I can't just say, oh, it's this part of my body that you're ignoring. So it's a bit confusing. And I think it's actually interesting, the mixed race phenomenon and mixed children, it's a bit confusing for us because we often have the experience of not belonging anywhere and constantly being there's always a bit of suspicion about us wherever we go. And we're not ideal, we're not, to people who are actually committed to white supremacist ideology, we're abominations. And to other folks who might even share blood with us, we're suspicious, we're those kids. And I certainly always felt that with some of my mother's family. Yeah, I certainly felt that we were those kids, those little coffee-colored kids.
So then when you started getting more seriously involved in your witchcraft and your quote-unquote spiritual practices, I guess I'm curious to know what it was like for you, particularly around race and around cultural appropriation in general, because my experience has been in different pagan and other spiritual traditions and communities here in the United States, particularly in the Bay Area and California, that a lot of people, there have been some challenging experiences of racism, both consciously and unconsciously, and even white people criticizing other white people of appropriating.
My favorite.
And again, I'm not trying to solve all the problems here with you today, but I'm particularly curious to know your experience because you live in a different country, another white country, with settlers and colonialist history, but also, the way that you have the challenge of straddling two worlds in a way.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in the States too, so I have this interesting perception and view into the strange uniqueness of what is the United States from not living in it, but from visiting it a lot. There's one thing that sticks out, and this is probably the beginning of oh, that's strange. I went to this pagan pride day in Brisbane when I was 14 or 15. And I was talking to this man who was a white Australian man who now lives in the States, and he writes books. He's a somewhat known occultist. He said this thing. I went up to him and I'm like, oh, I'm excited to go to your angelic magic workshop today. So I've always had a thing with angels, but the angels that are terrifying, not the angels that people... Anyway, that's a whole other story. And he was like, oh, and he looked at me and he was like, well, yeah, I'd love to have you, but why don't you go to that? He's like, where are you from? I'm like, oh, instantly I know, my father's from Bali. So I just kind of answered it like that. And he was like, why don't you go over to that Hawaiian spirituality workshop? So he coded me straight away. And because he knew I was from Bali, he just went, oh, that's an island in an ocean with brown people. Why don't you go over there? So he was kind of categorizing me, maybe because he thought, oh, which was deluded, be with your ancestors or be with the other colored people, which is a segregationist idea. And that had happened to me when I was younger too. And I was like, oh, that's really strange. I went to his angelic workshop. I was really confused. I had no interest in going to that Hawaiian spirituality workshop at all. And I guess earlier on, I was very interested in reclaiming my Celtic roots. And I saw witchcraft, because Balinese spirituality culture was just so alive in my life. And I went every year, I'd go back for a month or two with my mum and my sister, and we'd be in Bali and be completely immersed. But I was interested in reclaiming my mother's Indigenous roots as far as possible, or at least wisdom traditions held within them, right? And I saw witchcraft as a way to do that. And in some ways I still do. And yes, first I saw a lot of people of European descent, people we would now call white in the systems, searching for their Indigenous roots within paganism in the West and within witchcraft, which I think is noble, I think is essential, actually. And then I started noticing as well other things, which were a complete rejection of certain wisdom tradition and kind of upholding like a Eurocentricity and only listening to, European stories and only so that's one thing, and then another thing is trying to keep everything separate, clean, which is a racialist idea. And then also people, especially more, I noticed this honestly in the more New Age communities and networks, this desire to kind of learn from as much as possible, which I guess is fine, but often just without context, often decontextualizing wisdom traditions and with a lot of privilege, blind spots and disrespect, and meshing things together that should not be meshed together, that aren't coherent with each other. And I guess that some parts of the pagan world sit snugly or in tension against those parts of the New Age world. And I think actually those communities sometimes call each other out. Certainly, I don't think it's a problem. This is the thing. If someone is sitting in their room in Minnesota or walking down the street in Sydney and they are a spirit worker and they are alive to the web and they perceive and experience Kali come to them. Now, what that person who isn't related to that culture does with that, this is what qualifies whether or not it becomes respectful or not. And that's one of the key things with cultural appropriation. Does that person then go, oh, I am now a worshipper of Kali? Still fine. So what are you going to do about that? Are you going to go and access those wisdom traditions and learn and be humble? Are you going to talk to Kali with now your connection with her? Are you going to supplement that with respectful engagement with source material and potentially Hindu community, but not in an invasive tell me everything way? What kind of economic relationship do you have? Do you have relationships with Hindu people? Do you feel you're owed anything? Are you now going to go teach a workshop on Kali worship or just the goddess Kali as a divine feminine being who empowers and liberates women, and decontextualizing everything about her in that moment and charging hundreds of dollars? So that is cultural appropriation, and it actually links to the concept of property and to reappropriate things. There are now conversations, I see a lot of nuanced philosophical conversations about these things. Oh, the gods choose who the gods choose. I agree. But then what someone does with that, I often see a lot of hijacking of the conversation of cultural appropriation by white people, and often for hidden agendas. And sometimes it's, bashing other white people, going, oh, you're doing this and you're doing that. And I'm like, okay, but what you're doing there is setting up segregation, almost spiritual segregation. Because if someone is experiencing a deep, authentic call by a Mexican spirit or a Mexican healing tradition and they aren't culturally Mexican, that's still okay. Of course it is. But how that person acts and how that person engages, that qualifies everything. And it would be the difference between different forms of cultural appreciation, respect and lineage and mutual exchange, and cultural appropriation. And I think what a lot of people don't understand is that it all links to the reality of colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy. It links to that because people who are privileged racially in a system will often feel entitled to access whatever they want, and will often have the emotional and sometimes economic ability to do so. And then people from those traditions and cultures might even be displaced from those traditions and cultures, but considered to be connected and might not have the economic and emotional capacity to engage those traditions anymore. And that's really when it gets really complicated and honestly very frustrating for many Indigenous people and people of colour of all kinds of cultures, because we often see people who have economic independence or economic and social privilege and mobility being able to go and do, 200 hours of yogic training, regardless of whether or not it's actually very yogic, or who are walking around talking about Tantra with no understanding of what Tantra is. My favorite thing to say to people who tell me about Tantra is, oh, so you've meditated in the graveyard and eaten dog shit. Because they're like, what? And I'm like, oh, you just think Tantra is like feeling good and like sacred sexuality, which it's not. So, Tantra can manifest in that way, but, it's an esoteric initiatory lineage, or rather Tantra is a way of referring to several esoteric initiatory lineages that exist in Hindu, Buddhist, and Jainist cultures. So, I just refuse to call anything tantric unless it's contacted those traditions in an authentic way. I'm just going to call a spade, right? But I also don't walk around going, oh, that's this and that's this. I think it's really, really complicated because culture is complicated. But I also think it's obvious. And what frustrates me is, especially when white people kind of like, oh, what is cultural appropriation? Please tell me. I'm like, oh my God, it's so easy to understand. Maybe you can't get the emotional part of it, but actually it's really simple. The concept is really simple. Figure it out. Just figure it out, and don't then use that as a way to kind of guilt anyone into anything. Once you have the respectful understanding and insight into what it actually is on a social, political, historical level, then a dialogue can begin. And if you're experiencing this, that, and the other as a spirit worker, as a magician, as a witch, great. Let's have that conversation then. But no one owes anyone, certainly marginalized, oppressed people don't owe you anything. You, the person of privilege, or you, the person of power in a system.
Yeah, the gems that I'm pulling out from what you've said are the idea of appreciation and respect. And that's something that I've heard before, which is that, I think in general, if you look at the basic definition of cultural appropriation, that in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's more about what someone does with that. Like what you said of the white person from Minnesota who is summoned by or contacted by Kali and maybe wants to study that, but then do they approach that with appreciation and respect, both for the spiritual practice, but also for the history of oppression that culture may have gone through and the position of power that that person, being a white person in the United States, has born into, and how are they going to what are they going to do with that? And in some ways, maybe it's possible that Kali was like, I'm going to call in a white person to be my devotee as a way of moving culture forward.
Possibly.
Yeah.
Yeah, to have this cutting edge conversation, at least.
Exactly. And then the other thing that you said, which is, I would agree with, which is the most places I've seen people naming cultural appropriation as white people calling out other white people. And I think that that's just this part culture, which is so pervasive and probably has something to do with the white person who's doing the calling out, their own trauma or their rejection of their own whiteness or some other wound.
Yeah, so much is going on all of the time. I think another thing too, for me, is I try to hold a dynamic tension between compassion and fierce discernment. And I actually think I don't think they're diametrically opposed. I think compassion is served by discernment and discernment is served by compassion. And I think that the other thing to remember here is that there is a distinction between intention and impact. And so I experience this all the time. I find myself apologizing for my impact and practicing noticing the difference between my impact versus my intention, because it's so easy to say, oh, but that wasn't my intention. But to acknowledge the effects, to acknowledge my impact is very different, because sometimes a well-meaning person with great intentions will still, because of the realities of the world, impact certain people in a negative way. And that it takes a lot of courage and a lot of vulnerability and a lot of love and compassion and discernment to just own the impact and to apologize for the impact. And there's a difference between being held hostage for certain things, like when people have a particular personal vendetta against someone. But when it's cultural, when it's social, when it's political, when it's huge and large, and again, related to the soup we swim in, there's no one holding hostage, but the people experiencing the impact of being held hostage constantly. And so to express compassion and to express solidarity, and again, it's economic. Like, a lot of this is economic. A lot of people are afraid of money. I think it's actually really important to talk about money, certainly in what we call spirituality, right? And to talk about money and economics and how this impacts us on a day-to-day, night-to-night level, therefore impacts our sense of spirituality. And so a lot of cultural appropriation is linked to money and to privilege and to economy and social mobility. And so that's where a lot of the real pain is. So when a black person who's raised in the States as a black person is seeing a white man who was raised in a colonial country authoring books on dead black people and saying, I channeled this magical tradition, and now have a book deal, I may or may not be referencing something specific right now. And that's very painful. Like, so again, it's like, oh, but my intention. Well, what about your impact? Like, what about your impact? It's great. Like, and then, you can leverage all your black friends, who may or may not agree with you, but what about your impact? And so I think that's a very big thing to own.
Yeah, I think it is really important just for people to acknowledge any way that they may have unintentionally harmed someone. And especially when it comes to someone that we don't know, like, we don't know that person. We don't know how what it is that we say or do is going to impact someone, and to just take the feedback and be mindful about it moving forward and know that it's okay, that they don't have to be perfect. So you have a workshop coming up with Raven Stanfield, who's another guest that I've had on the show, that you said sort of relates to this. I wonder if you want to share a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this all came from Raven visiting me in Bali earlier this year. And we'd been planning that for a while, like, being together in Bali. And there were several things going on there. We have a lot of conversations, Raven and I, about these issues and about the impact of racism on our spiritual communities. And we wanted to talk about the importance of also connecting with the body as the vault of living memory, which I don't think is even, or maybe it is my phraseology, but I think it's pretty much inspired by someone else's phraseology, as everything is anyway. And so we were talking about kind of facilitate. We've talked together before at Reclaiming Witch Camps and in the Reclaiming Tradition, and we thought, what can we offer to people who are looking for connection to the body, who are looking to sink into the land, the numinousness of the land in authentic, that is an overused word, but I mean it, in authentic and intimate ways, in sensual and powerful ways. And what is this concept of the heart in different traditions, right? Like in Anderson Feri, we often talk about the black heart of innocence. What does that actually mean? Let's crack that open. In various Hindu mystical traditions, there is bhakti, which is like this devotional praise, and an amazing embodiment of bhakti is Hanuman, who often appears as a monkey and is often, in various religious iconographies, holding open his heart. And it's such this, I always try to see an image of Hanuman opening his heart, and there's Rama and Sita there. It's just so moving. Or, Mary or Jesus Christ holding their flaming hearts, their sacred hearts. So we called this, Our Hearts Are Made to Break Open, which is going to be this weekend intensive in Portland, Oregon on the 19th and 20th of October. And how is that breaking open of the heart, which so many people are experiencing heartbreak right now? But how can we transmute that into the broken open heart? And drawing inspiration from these traditions that we're a part of, and from Anderson Feri, from Reclaiming, and from Hinduism, and also from the Chinese medicine that Raven is, proficient within and has studied, for decades and practices, because there are also teachings, wisdom teachings within Chinese medicine that I don't know a great deal about, that are even, I have Chinese ancestry, but this is the thing, right? Like, I haven't sat there and studied for decades Chinese medicine that Raven has. There is some pain in that for me too, but I certainly don't look at Raven, whose descent is various, as doing anything wrong. She's doing many things right, and she's completely committed and disciplined and very, very, in my mind, someone who is very engaged in these conversations and isn't trying to be puritanically perfect, because I think that's where we get into trouble. And I think that's a very white ideology and a very Protestant one too, actually. So basically all of that in an intensive, a lot of it's going to be nonverbal, a lot of it's about movement, a lot of it's about ecstasy again and direct communion with the mystery. But a lot of it will be talking as well, talking about our heartbreak and talking about our shadows and cultural shadows.
And that is October 19th in Portland?
Yeah, 19th and 20th. Yeah.
Well, I will have that in the show notes for people.
Yay.
So as we start to wrap up, can you share with us a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish?
I will say that I think right now it will be actually the Reclaiming tradition. I came into the Reclaiming tradition already a practicing witch in another tradition. And so I've been involved in Reclaiming for a decade now and taught a lot in it. And I think why I say that is because 2 years after I came in, I went to the 2012 Dandelion, which is like a big intra-reclaiming council. And it was happening just outside of Portland in Oregon, actually. And we were there to discuss and break down and have very real emotional conversations about a very particular phrase in the Principles of Unity, which is the only document that it's not necessarily held to be sacrosanct because it's already been changed. And maybe that's the sacrosanct process of it. It was written by the Reclaiming Collective in 96 and I think published in 97. I'm actually staring at it right now. It's on my desk. And it's the only thing that one needs to read and agree to or align with or be in conversation with to identify as a reclaiming witch. And there was a phrase in there that was very binary. It was specifically talking about the god and the goddess, and myself included. A lot of people in reclaiming or drawn to reclaiming struggled with that, the language and the implications and the impact of that language. And I think there was another passage that may have said men and women. And so I, as a non-binary person and who has always felt that way my whole life and only recently had better language for it, I used to just call myself genderless. And so I went to this place, I went to this forest with, maybe 120 other reclaiming people. And we all sat and for days and after years of salons and engagement around gender, sat and we talked and people had fish bowls with, trans and gender non-conforming people talking and, cis people listening or non-trans people listening and opening up the dialogue around what gender is and can be and what the Principles of Unity could be. And some people, a small handful, left the tradition over this, but the Principles of Unity did change in that gathering. And then it was sent out, through the lands of reclaiming, so to speak. And it ruffled a lot of people's feathers and it excited others. And it was a powerful time. And this is 7 years ago, I guess. Yeah, 7 years ago, this, last month, I think. And I just think that was very powerful because I remember seeing Starhawk and Rosemary Dance, who are two mothers of reclaiming, stand up in front of a bunch of us in the trees and say, look, we are not here to argue whether or not reclaiming is an inclusive tradition. We are an inclusive tradition. So therefore, if that is true, which it is, no one's arguing that and no one did. What does that mean for those people amongst us who are saying, we are in pain, we are struggling with this, we have to take it seriously? And so it was taken seriously and maybe too late, but maybe things are never too late, really. And I remember so much joy and catharsis and power and tears and laughter, when it was consented to, this is the new phrase, which, is now something like we welcome all genders and all gender histories, and then it continues all races, all ages, etc. And to make such a proclamation these days is actually kind of controversial because there are many witchcraft traditions and spiritual communities where trans people and gender non-conforming people are rejected from, and where there is isolation and marginalization actively engaged. And so I think in that moment, even though I had already identified as a reclaiming witch, that in that moment I was like, oh yes, this is good stuff because it's messy, it's real, and everyone here is willing to engage that. And that was very illuminating in that moment.
Mm-hmm. So Fio, where can people find you or learn more about your work and your offerings and your classes? So ironically, a lot of my public work is not under my name, Fio, which is kind of the name I go by in my day-to-day life. It's under my Balinese name,
which is Gede Parma, which is GedeParma. So, .com, which is my website. And most of my stuff is on there. I also have, you can also look me up by that name on Facebook, and there's like a public page as well, which I'm so not active on. Apologies. Mostly I'm teaching a lot, and so you can find access to different online courses I teach and different classes and intensives I teach in person. I do a lot of magical mentorship as well. So occasionally I have spaces available I have a limited number of spaces for my own sanity. And so occasionally one is free or two are free. And so I offer them again. And so information about those would be on my website or on my public Facebook page. I also am on Instagram, but it's whatever Instagram is, which is also Gede Parma, which is like GEDE_PARMA. I think that's about it. Oh, and then I have this podcast that I recently started with a friend, which is called Antipodean Arts Podcast, which is about the practice of witchcraft and magic, or it's based in the idea of the practice of witchcraft and magic and the engagement of the paranormal in the Antipodes or in the Southern Hemisphere. But we have guests from all over also talk to us.
Well, thank you so much for being here and helping me wade through the weeds of these challenging conversations and let people know, our listeners, that they are also not alone as we sort out these challenging concepts and ideas and feelings and thoughts that we have as we move through the world, both the mundane and the ecstatic.
Thank you.
I work with many queer folks who struggle to get their needs met or who suffer from having their boundaries violated by others. Because you may not have been cared for the best, you might have a hard time identifying your needs. Or because you have been violated or bullied, you might not completely understand where exactly your boundaries are. If you'd like some help exploring your needs and building more resilient boundaries, head over to my website and download the free guide, Needs, Boundaries, and Self-Care Support for Queer Folks. This is a short introduction to help you start to shift and change your relationship to yourself and others, and to feel more safe and resourced day to day. So just head over to queerhealingjourneys.com/needs to download your free guide today. To find the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. And if you enjoyed the show, remember to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. This will help us reach and support more queer people all over. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.